Hello and good evening, everybody. It is me, Julian, and I'm delighted to be with you here live today. I am currently in Stratford-on-Avon, and this is going to be a 30-minute lecture, if you will, in which I'm going to talk a little bit about Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet. Here I have a German translation called Das Buch der Unruhe. And I was reading this book, and I came across what to my mind felt like a tacit linkage to Adorno's Minima Moralia, Reflexionen aus dem beschädigten Leben, or Reflections from Damaged Life, as it is translated in the Verso Press Radical Series version. Also, here I have the English complete edition of the Book of Disquiet, which is actually quite different from the German edition, so not a one-on-one translation. In fact, for those of you who are interested in Pessoa, when it comes to reading the Book of Disquiet, it's very fragmentary. And this means that the manner in which you choose to present these fragments is actually an editorial decision that impacts quite greatly the very nature of the book. Anyway, that's something that we can talk about in a little bit. And the tentative title of this lecture is going to be The Sickness Unto Death, which is, of course, a not so tacit reference to Kierkegaard. All that and more coming up in the next 30 minutes. I see some people joining us from around the world. Hello back to India. Brings me great joy that we are connecting globally. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. I am also recording this, and I will be posting the audio to Patreon, which I do for every lecture. And on Patreon, you can also download my recurring ebook subscription, where every 3 months I post a ebook that summarizes the lectures, and the most recent ebook is titled The Fundamental Fantasy, a brief introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Hello to New York City. Hello to Canada. I see you. I'm joining you live from Stratford-on-Avon, and it is wonderful to be here. Okay, let's jump right in. So, this past week, I was reading, or perhaps I should say rereading, for this is a book that one never truly can finish reading. It is one of those never-ending encounters one has with a piece of literature. I was reading Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, Das Buch der Unruhe, which is written from the perspective, or in the voice, of one of Pessoa's many heteronyms, in this case, the figure of Bernardo Suarez. And what this does wonderfully is, in a very fragmentary way, it offers brief reflections on what you might call the problem of existence, the problem of life, and how to find some meaning and purpose amidst the condition of being alive. In fact, if you go to the very beginning of the English translation of the Book of Disquiet, there's a wonderful line in which he writes, here we go. Anything that involves action, be it war or reasoning, is false, and anything that involves abdication is false too. If only I knew how not to act and how not to abdicate from action either, that would be the dream crown of my glory, the silent scepter of my greatness. Now, if that sounds like something you would enjoy, you can read more of that in the Book of Disquiet. But I'd like to direct your attention to a very brief passage in the German edition titled Das Buch der Unruhe. And this passage is titled Absurdes, or The Absurd. The absurd was a key topic and theme for Pessoa, who advocated approaching life as an absurdity. And I'd like to direct you to one specific sentence in this passage, and I'll read it to you in German, and then I will attempt a translation into English. And from there, we can make a leap over to Adorno's Minima Moralia. So, Pessoa writes the following words. He writes, Wir können mit dem Leben einzig im Einklang sein, wenn wir mit uns selbst im Missklang sind. That roughly or loosely translates into, we can only be in sync with life if we are out of sync with ourselves. And essentially the argument that Pessoa is making here, or to be precise, Bernardo Suarez is making, is that to lead a healthy, normal, well-adjusted life is itself a kind of sickness. That to present as happy, to present as functional and productive, is itself a violence that we do unto ourselves. And as I was reading this passage, it immediately brought to mind a section from Adorno's Minima Moralia. Now, it's worth noting that Adorno's Minima Moralia's Reflections on Damaged Life is written in a style that is very similar to Pessoa's own writing. It's essentially fragmentary, it's little critical reflections on contemporary existence. And this is something that Adorno did in part to entertain but also comfort his friend and colleague Horkheimer. In fact, the book itself is dedicated to Horkheimer, and the challenge that Adorno set himself in writing this was to pay attention to the things around him, the things that might not be noteworthy on a professional basis, and to instead try to critique them and to analyze them. And I should have put a bookmark in this, but let's see if we can find it nonetheless. I have a habit of losing my bookmarks. It's a passage in which, interestingly enough, Adorno directly cites Kierkegaard in the title. And he makes an argument that is very, very similar to the argument made by Pessoa. Here we go. Die Gesundheit zum Tode, which is a reference to Kierkegaard, sickness unto death, which I'll return to in a moment. And Adorno writes the following words, and I think the key passage is actually at the end. He writes, trostlos aber der Gedanke, dass der Krankheit des Normalen nicht etwa die Gesundheit des Kranken ohne weiteres gegenübersteht, sondern dass diese meist nur das Schema des gleichen Unheils auf andere Weise vorstellt. And this is a complicated but really beautiful passage, because let's take it step by step. Pessoa makes the argument that to lead a healthy existence in a modern world is itself a kind of sickness. To present as productive and happy is itself a social ill. But Adorno, seemingly in dialogue with Pessoa, adds to this, just because healthy, productive living constitutes a sickness does not by definition imply that to live a sick life is a form of health. And essentially what Adorno therefore is arguing is that it's not enough simply to say that if healthy, popular, well-adjusted life is a sickness, we cannot thereby by definition say that to be sick and alienated, unhappy and depressed is itself a kind of health. In fact, this is almost, and I think it perhaps quite directly, is a tacit reference to Nietzsche's writing. Nietzsche, towards the end of his life, and specifically also in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in Nietzsche's sort of late stage, if you will, megalomaniacal phase, Nietzsche makes the argument that the sanest is the sickest, or if you will, that the perspective of the crazy person, the supposedly crazy person, is the only source of truth. And that people who are well-adjusted in the world, who practice common sense, are therefore those who are not speaking truth. And here, Nietzsche himself is actually doing something that can be traced all the way back to Plato. Plato made the argument that so-called common sense is in fact what today would be called ideology. So-called common sense is in fact the opposite of truth. And Plato, in a sense, here foreshadowed Hegel's anti-wisdom stance. The idea that wisdom, something which can be summarized and simplified into an aphorism that speaks to everyone, is therefore a kind of falsehood. For Plato, truth was always the problematization of this type of evident truth, a truth which supposedly spoke for itself, i.e. common sense. Hence, for Plato, truth wasn't something that could be bottled. Instead, truth was a truth procedure. This implied that to speak truth was to problematize what appeared to you as a self-evident truth, i.e. something natural. Hence, the task of the philosopher was to essentially be the crazy man who put a spoke into the rungs, who put a stick into the spoke of truth. Thank you. My analogy sort of fell apart there, but you know what I mean. And Adorno continues this, and Nietzsche continues this, and in a sense, Pessoa continues this. Nietzsche's argument is that the craziest person is always the most sane, which is to say, to be sane in a crazy world is itself a kind of madness. To be well adjusted in a crazy world is itself a kind of evil. To be happy and fulfilled in a world that is fraying at its very edges is itself to be complicit. Hence, essentially, it's an inversion of the adage that ignorance is bliss. The philosophical idea is that the more you know, the more you realize that pain and suffering can be highly universal. But more than that, it's also the realization that knowledge problematizes the seeming security of your surroundings. The things that you took for granted, that you thought were true, turn out to be false, etc. In other words, the truth procedure that is implied by philosophy is a painful process. The process of awakening, the process of discovering truths, is inherently uncomfortable and will make you a social outcast. In fact, if you go all the way back to antiquity, certain Greek thinkers already argued that the barbaroi was always the voice of truth. In other words, that if you really wanted an honest opinion about the lay of the land, you should ask someone who came from abroad. Somebody who essentially could look at your society, not as somebody who was indoctrinated into it, but somebody who stood externally to it. Of course, today we often see the exact opposite. People say, oh, you can't have an opinion on my society because you weren't born here, you weren't raised here. But the Platonic philosophical truth procedure is inherently anti-identitarian. The whole point is about undermining the seeming security of any foundation from which you might speak, from which you might build or rest upon your, build or create your certainties. Now, I realize that I'm biting off a little bit more than I can chew here, and so I'd like to take a step back and go back to Adorno's actual text. And it might be instructive here to go to the English version and leave behind the German for a moment. Here we have, on page 58, the same passage in English, which he titles The Health Unto Death. And it's important to note here, and it's actually in the footnotes, that this is an inversion of the title of Kierkegaard's work, The Sickness Unto Death. In other words, Adorno's being ironic here. Adorno's saying that the contemporary issue within what we call capitalism isn't that we have a sickness unto death, it's that we have health unto death. Health is the contemporary version of being sick. Being well adjusted, going to the gym, and creating and sculpting a body that matches a certain ideal is what Adorno calls a sickness. In other words, health becomes the new sick. Here we have the Nietzschean inversion applied to Adorno's critique of ideology. And Adorno puts it like this. Again, it's important to note that Adorno is very sardonic here. He writes, the regular guy, the popular girl, have to repress not only their desires and insights, but even the symptoms that in bourgeois times resulted from repression. And then he continues, I want to get to the gym part. The German version is shorter, obviously. Yes, the very people who burst with proofs of exuberant vitality could easily be taken for prepared corpses, from whom the news of their not quite successful decease has been withheld for reasons of population policy. Underlying the prevalent health is death. All the movements of health resemble the reflex movements of beings whose hearts have stopped beating. Scarcely ever does an unhappily furrowed brow, bearing witness to terrible and long-forgotten exertions, or a moment of pathic stupidity disrupting smooth logic, or an awkward gesture embarrassingly preserve a trace of vanished life. Beautiful passage from Adorno in the Minima Moralia. Now, it's important to note that Adorno isn't just being a crank. Instead, he's practicing a form of what you might call the critique of ideology. The contemporary ideological imperative is essentially biopolitical in nature. And what I mean by that is that you are told to lead your happiest, healthiest, most productive life, to make sure that you sculpt your body to look exactly like the people in the magazines, etc. And that if you fail to do so, your life is somehow not worth living, not worth protecting, not worth being represented, or should you perish, not worth being mourning. As Judith Butler once famously argued, we have lives that are worth mourning, that are considered more alive than others. It's the Orwellian maxim from Animal Farm all over again. Everyone is equal, but some people are more equal than others. And the promise of a consumer society in a late capitalist society is that everyone has equal opportunities, that we live in a supposed meritocracy, and that if you adopt the right mindset, and if you read simplified Stoic maxims about the power of self optimization and so on and so forth, that you too can lead your healthiest, happiest, wealthiest life. And Adorno argues that whilst this is presented as a form of emancipation, it is in fact a form of slavery. It is a form of turning your life into a kind of reified commodity in which everybody acts the same and dresses the same and aspires to the very same things. However, it's also important to note that Adorno isn't making an argument for diversity of identity. He's not saying that fitness culture equates fat shaming, etc. Instead, what Adorno is arguing is that this, if you will, post transcendental, post ideological imperative to enjoy is itself a kind of sickness, a sickness that causes alienation and loss of meaning and purpose. And it's sad because we're all looking for a better life, a happier life, a healthier life. And yet, Adorno says that the way in which we imagine that possibility and the way in which that possibility is sold to us is, in fact, something that oppresses us. In fact, I think here it's actually important to take a step back to Kierkegaard's argument. Kierkegaard arguments in Sickness Unto Death is that the sickness unto death is essentially life. As he puts it, it is despair. It's the despair that you experience at the realization that your life is finite, that everything that you do will ultimately be lacking in purpose and meaning. And yet, this is precisely where meaning and purpose comes from. It's the embrace of your fate, what Nietzsche called amor fati. And yet, amor fati isn't a self help maxim about simply accepting that which cannot be changed or changing yourself before you change the world or any other sort of conservative adage that essentially focuses on the individual above the collective. Instead, Kierkegaard's argument is that from the perspective of Christianity, for this is the argument that Kierkegaard is making, the only way to live is to essentially embrace this despair, not try to overcome it or ignore it, but instead to make yourself radically subject to it. In fact, as Zizek has argued, Kierkegaard's basic position mirrors that of psychoanalysis, which is to say, one of the central lessons of psychoanalysis is that in order to truly live, you have to embrace what is known as the death drive, which is to say, to truly live isn't to try to stretch your lifespan to the longest, or to try to optimize and preserve your body until you become a kind of living corpse, as Adorno would put it. But instead, to live is to make yourself subject to something that goes beyond your immediate reality. As Zizek puts it, identify one thing that you want to live for, something that you would be willing to die for, and then go for it completely. This is a form of subjective destitution, if you will. The death drive, which I've spoken about quite a bit in the past, the death drive, therefore, is the paradoxical process by which you feel most alive at the exact point in which you cease to consider your life as something that you have to optimize and preserve. It's when you're willing to give yourself completely to something or to someone that you feel most alive. And this is also the central lesson of Christianity. The central lesson of Christianity is that you have to make yourself subject to something that goes beyond your own finite mortal existence. Not simply to commit good acts so as to be rewarded in heaven, which would be a strange taxonomy indeed, but instead the paradoxical process by which what you give is what you receive. It's the exact point at which you feel like you have made yourself slave to something that you become free. And paradoxically, as Nietzsche and Kierkegaard both stressed, it is precisely the man who believes himself to be utterly free who is a slave. This is Nietzsche's basic maxim that the easiest way to enslave somebody is to convince them that they are free. Vice versa, from a Kierkegaardian perspective, the easiest way to be free is to make yourself a slave. Make yourself a slave to something that is a complete imperative in your life, something that you have to do, something that it feels like you have no choice but to do. In fact, from a Kantian perspective, we see the logical conclusion of this when it comes to freedom. Kant's basic position apropos freedom is that freedom isn't the power to do anything. Freedom is essentially the compulsion to do one thing. And this is a paradox because we usually think of freedom as the ability to choose between many different things that you could do. Of course, as we see within contemporary capitalism, this is often a pseudo or false choice. You can walk into a supermarket and choose between 20 different types of cereal, but that doesn't truly grant you any autonomous agency. It's simply the illusion of choice. In fact, one could make the argument from a Kantian perspective that freedom is precisely when it feels like you have no choice but to act. Which is to say, in the same way that there's the maxim that you only truly know who you are when you act under duress, i.e., when you are forced to act, Kant says that true freedom is when you are compelled to do something to the point where it feels like no other option was possible. I've mentioned this before, but Zizek has quite a nice example about this, and apologies if you've already heard this. Zizek says, imagine that somebody passes out in the street and nobody really pays attention. Everybody keeps walking. And at a certain point, you stop, you call an ambulance, and you save that person's life. Later, somebody says, oh my gosh, you're a hero. You saved this person's life. Why did you do it? And your answer would probably be, because I had no choice. Of course I had to act. And this is precisely what Kant means by freedom. Freedom isn't the possibility of action. Instead, it is recognizing the absolute need for one specific action. Everybody else had the same choice, but no one acted. You were the one who saw the situation and recognized in the situation an imperative. You had to act. Of course you had to act. And this urgent need to act, this feeling that there's not even a choice, is for Kant paradoxically exactly what freedom looks like. And here you can see an inversion that runs through Adorno and Pessoa and Kierkegaard as well. If freedom is making yourself radically subject to something, i.e., if freedom is the choice by which you make yourself a slave, then vice versa, true knowledge, the pursuit of truth, isn't the process by which you conform to others to the point at which you become a healthy, productive person, but instead a difficult process of self-emancipation, of seeking out the hard truths and saying the things that are hard to say and standing up for what you believe in and essentially making yourself uncomfortable. In fact, ultimately, this is what a truth procedure is. It's not simply that which saying that which is convenient, that which is already accepted by others. It's saying that which will not be accepted by others. When Nietzsche says that the craziest person is the most sane, he's saying something very similar to what Schopenhauer argued. Schopenhauer had an admittedly outmoded theory of genius. After all, we don't really think in those terms anymore. But Schopenhauer said that one of the characteristics of genius was that their insights were at first dismissed, then ridiculed, and finally accepted as being self-evident. And I really like that theory because the first stage of a truth procedure is that nobody even takes you seriously. Like what you're doing doesn't even register. Then, when it registers enough, people start fighting it. They start resisting it. And finally, and this is the moment in which your position has essentially become a new truth, a new hegemonic position of the time, people pretend like the thing that you fought for is self-evident. And there's a political dimension here as well. We can never rest secure that the rights that we have in a civic society are permanent. The battle for them has to be restaged over and over for each subsequent generation. You can never take for granted that the liberties that were given to you at birth are those which you will pass on to your children, or which you might even have it at your death. And so the whole point is that active agency is the process of realizing that you can change your surroundings, but it begins by saying uncomfortable truths, by doing something which other people have not yet identified as being important or valuable. And ultimately, I believe that the reason that Schopenhauer's theory of genius has value isn't because we should aspire to being geniuses or whatever romantic notion you have of individual brilliance, but because the very basic aspect of genius is thereby universal, that everybody has within them the power to do something and say something which as of yet cannot be considered the norm, but which will reveal itself over time to have been significantly universal and important. In fact, this was the entire emancipatory slogan of the 1960s and of 68 in particular, that essentially it was about articulating things which therefore had not been considered possible, to expand the social imagination. The famous slogan about the sand underneath the pavement, the sand underneath the pavement was to say that everything that appears to you as secure, as the solid foundation upon which a civic society rests, is in fact something which was built and constructed, something which is temporary, something which reflects a seemingly permanent hegemony, which is inherently fragile in its uh, social situation, and that therefore to fight for change, to fight for progressive values, is to constantly point out the way in which what appears to be permanent is in fact impermanent. But let's take a step back for a moment because I want to wrap up here. We've bitten off perhaps even more than we can chew. I want to go back to Pessoa's argument. Pessoa in the Book of Disquiet says that to lead an outwardly happy and healthy existence, to be well adjusted to modern life, to essentially be someone who posts pictures on Instagram of how perfect your life is and how happy you are, that this is not only disingenuous, but this is itself a kind of sickness. In fact, that the most sick people are perhaps those who present as outwardly healthy. Adorno, however, who we cannot expect to have read Pessoa, but who engages with the same problem in Minima Moralia, cautions by saying just because the healthy are sick in an ideological sense, does not imply that the sick are healthy. Essentially, Adorno is therefore responding to the Nietzschean and Kierkegaardian element in Pessoa. Nietzsche, towards the end of his life, argues that the most wise or the most sane is the most insane, that the seemingly crazy philosopher is the source of truth. And Adorno cautions against this. He says we cannot allow ourselves the comfort, the narcissistic, if you will, reassurance that just because everybody else is crazy, we somehow are not. In other words, Adorno is cautioning us by saying that we should also investigate our own practices, our own complacency, our own participation in everyday life. That perhaps the true lesson of the contemporary critique of ideology is that we cannot count ourselves out, that we too cannot be considered exempt from this. Now, we know that Pessoa was a reader of Kierkegaard. And we know that Adorno was a reader of Kierkegaard. And in Pessoa's passage on the absurd, and in Adorno's passage on the health unto death, which is his ironic inversion of the sickness unto death, we can therefore triangulate, if you will, a particularly modern preoccupation with the problem of how to lead a healthy life, a virtuous life. And what's interesting is that that preoccupation is, of course, something that goes all the way back to antiquity. It is the problem of virtue, the problem articulated by Aristotle. How does one live a virtuous life? And what marks Kierkegaard and Nietzsche as modernists avant la lettre is that they're beginning to spell out the peculiar paradox by which the seemingly virtuous are in fact the depraved. And those who are considered depraved by society are often those who might articulate what it means to be virtuous. Hence, they're beginning to articulate what you might call a theory of the part of no part, the site roncière. The idea that the truth procedure, the central operation or project of philosophy, is something that stems from the marginalized, something that comes from the voiceless, those who are counted out, who literally have no part in the common society. Hence, Pessoa's modernist turn, for indeed that is what it is, it's a reflection on the contradictions of emergent modern life, which puts him in, I think, a similar context as, for example, Kafka and later Orwell, is something that we find in its most radical form in Adorno's Minima Moralia. Hence, I would like to conclude this lecture by encouraging you to read these texts, to read Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, to pick up Adorno's Minima Moralia. These are books that can be read a page at a time. They are short fragments that can change the way in which you look at your surroundings and thereby perhaps change your relationship to what philosophy is. And so instead of picking up a self-help book that teaches you the ancient wisdoms of the philosophers and how it can help you be more productive in your day-to-day life, pick up one of these books. Pick up one of these books. And these books will convince you that those self-help books that instrumentalize philosophy into common sense are in fact the very enemy of philosophy, the very antithesis to the truth procedure, which is philosophy. And so the continuation of philosophy occurs in these modernist texts by other means. And I really hope that this lecture will encourage you to pick up some Pessoa and pick up some Adorno. And perhaps I should apologize for not reading Pessoa in the Portuguese, which is the most beautiful version of it. And if you can read that, I highly encourage you to do so. Thank you so much. This lecture has been titled The Sickness Unto Death, or as Adorno puts it, The Health Unto Death. The contemporary fixation with health and what it says about our current ideological situation. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are patrons, I will be joining you in 5 minutes for a bonus seminar recording, during which I am happy to answer your questions and engage in further discussion. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week. And it has truly been my pleasure to be with you here today. Bye-bye.